It all started with a question Australia wasn't prepared to answer. A question that sounded simple on the surface, yet carried the weight of an entire nation's attitude toward royalty. Does Prince Harry still deserve royal treatment? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question exploded across newsrooms, online forums, parliamentary offices, hotel boardrooms, and kitchen tables across Australia the moment the story leaked. The Duke of Sussex was reportedly requesting a taxpayer-funded, five-star luxury hotel suite ahead of his planned return to Australia. A suite fit not just for a royal, but for someone who expected royal privilege without holding a royal job. But Australia didn't just hesitate. They said no. And that no didn't echo quietly. It boomed. Have you ever seen a moment where a nation collectively tilts its head and says, "Wait, what?" That was this moment. Because this wasn't a simple accommodation request. This wasn't just a fancy room. This was a test of power, perception, and respect, played out on a global stage. And the Australian government, known for its blunt honesty and no-nonsense political culture, did something no one expected. They pushed back. Hard. But before we get to the blow-by-blow fallout, the explosive reactions, the internal memos, and the behind-the-scenes arguments that nearly derailed an entire visit, we need to step into the exact moment this story became a spark, then a flame, then a wildfire. Because trust me, the wildfire didn't start with Harry. It started with the growing frustration many Commonwealth nations feel, yet rarely articulate out loud. In Australia, they just became the first to say it clearly. Let's rewind to the beginning, the moment the request reached Canberra. Picture a routine government morning. Coffee mugs clinking, staffers shuffling papers, emails dinging, sunlight hitting the sandstone buildings of Parliament House in that bright, unforgiving Canberra way. A staffer opens an email, a standard diplomatic travel request. Nothing unusual, until they scroll, and scroll, and scroll. A luxury suite, expansive security requirements, special privacy accommodations, a full floor sealed off from the public, custom furniture adjustments, dietary demands that sounded less like a menu and more like a negotiation contract. And at the end of it all, cost absorbed by Australia. That's when eyebrows shot up. That's when staffers glanced at each other. That's when the first murmurs began. Not because of the request itself. After all, visiting dignitaries and royal figures often come with non-negotiable security and privacy needs. But because of the context. Harry wasn't a working royal anymore. He wasn't representing King Charles. He wasn't visiting in an official royal capacity. He wasn't acting on behalf of the Commonwealth. Yet the request suggested otherwise. And this is where the tension begins to simmer. If you're watching this right now, let me ask you something. Should a prince who stepped away from royal duties still expect royal privileges, especially on another country's taxpayer dime? Or does stepping away mean stepping down? Australia was about to answer that question with a clarity that shocked the world. But before that came the leak. The leak that twisted this from an internal matter to the biggest headline on the continent. Because someone, and to this day, no one has publicly identified who, sent the details of Harry's alleged request to the press. Whether it was frustration, politics, or principle, we may never know. But within minutes of that leak hitting journalists' inboxes, all of Australia erupted. Talk shows, podcasts, social media, newspaper sites crashing under the traffic. Memes came first, because of course they did. Then disbelief. Then outrage. Then a fierce debate that split the nation into two camps. Camp 1, he's still a prince. This is how royals travel. Camp 2, he left. Let him pay for it himself. And somewhere in the middle sat the government, watching the storm intensify, aware they couldn't simply approve the request without becoming the next target. Remember this moment. This is where the story shifts from a controversy into a crisis. Because public backlash wasn't the only thing happening. Behind closed doors, there were far more serious discussions. Internal memos warning of political ramifications. Advisors concerned about appearing to waste public funds during a cost-of-living crisis. Tourism officials worried about losing leverage with taxpayers. One particular memo, the one that will define the next hour of this story, circulated across high-level Australian government desks. A memo advising caution. A memo that questioned whether this luxury suite request was reasonable under the circumstances. And then came the line. The line that changed everything. We are not obligated to provide accommodations beyond standard diplomatic protocol for individuals not representing the crown. That sentence ignited a fire, because it wasn't just a logistical point. It was a philosophical one. If Harry wasn't a working royal, why was he asking for working royal privilege? This wasn't just about a hotel anymore. This was about legitimacy, status, influence, and a government deciding whether they should treat Harry as a duke, a celebrity, or, for the first time in his life, simply a private citizen. And let's be honest, Australia has a reputation for being easygoing, friendly, and famously casual. But push past the casual exterior, and you'll find a political culture that does not tolerate entitlement. Not for celebrities, not for billionaires, and definitely not for royals who have voluntarily stepped away from their duties. Meanwhile, across the globe, in Los Angeles, the Sussex team had no idea the story had already picked up enough momentum to start shaping policy. But the Australian government did. And that's when the second leak dropped. Yes, a second leak. One that didn't outline the request, but the reaction. An internal comment overheard by a staffer. We cannot treat him like a working royal because he is not a working royal. Boom. Gasoline. Match. Fireball. The story lit up international media. British tabloids. American networks. European commentary shows. Everyone suddenly wanted a piece of the drama. Why? Because it wasn't just about Harry. It was about the symbolic unraveling of royal privilege in the modern world. For decades, Commonwealth nations have rolled out the red carpet for the royal family, even when they weren't obliged to. Australians have lined streets. Governments have spent millions on security, hospitality, ceremonial events. But now, a line was being drawn. A very bold line. And this line wasn't invisible. It was public, global, and loud. Australia sent a message, whether intentionally or not. The rules have changed. But here's where things get even stranger. And this is the part people think they know, but they don't. The Australian government wasn't just silently reviewing the request. They were actively debating alternatives. Not all alternatives were flattering. Not all alternatives were diplomatic. And some alternatives, well, let's just say that even mentioning them out loud sparked heated arguments inside Parliament. Because depending on who you talked to, Harry was either a symbol of modern independence or a symbol of celebrity-driven entitlement. Two opposing images, two incompatible narratives, and one government caught in the middle. But while Canberra debated, something else happened behind the scenes. A luxury hotel chain suddenly found itself in the spotlight, dragged into the center of a royal-adjacent scandal they didn't ask for. Phone calls, emails, legal consultations, PR warnings. The chain wasn't just preparing a room. They were preparing for global scrutiny, political tension, and a possible PR nightmare. Because if they agreed to host Harry under the conditions requested, they risked appearing complicit. If they declined, they risked angering a global celebrity. They were stuck. But their decision, which we will get into in the chapters ahead, shocked everyone, including the Sussex camp. And that's the theme of this entire story. Everyone was shocked by someone. The government shocked the public. The public shocked the government. The hotel shocked the Sussex team. The Sussex team shocked the press. And the press shocked the world. And we haven't even scratched the surface yet. Because the biggest twist of all, the one no one was prepared for, the one that changed how the world viewed Harry's return to Australia, it hasn't been revealed yet. But we're getting there. Right now, we're standing at the edge of the first major turning point. The moment where the Australian government had to decide whether to bend with tradition or stand with the people. And trust me, whichever choice they made was going to define the entire visit. Because this wasn't just a hotel room. This wasn't just a diplomatic arrangement. This wasn't just public outrage. This was the first real test of Harry's post-royal identity. Was he truly a private individual? Or did he still expect the world to treat him like the prince he walked away from being? Australia was ready to answer that question. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It began with one of those emails that looks ordinary until you open it. The kind of message that appears harmless until a single paragraph sends an entire government office into stunned silence. That's exactly what happened inside a quiet Canberra department office when a routine travel coordination email from an international liaison landed in an inbox. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Visiting figures often had specific needs, security teams, transportation logistics, communication protocols, and sometimes accommodations far above standard hotel stays. Bureaucrats were used to this. They'd handled presidents, diplomats, royal figures, global executives, celebrities who demanded private elevators, entire chefs flown in from overseas, and even an award-winning actor who once asked for a hotel to temporarily swap out every single light bulb because he didn't like the color temperature. But this request? This one was different. Very different. Because the sender wasn't representing a head of state, nor a working diplomat, nor an officially visiting royal. It was a request involving Prince Harry, a man who had stepped away from royal duties yet still, in this moment, appeared to expect every ounce of privilege that came with the title he no longer used in any professional capacity. And that contradiction, that clash between who he was and what he was asking for, that was the spark. The email laid out the details in flat, polite, diplomatic language. But the substance? It was extraordinary. A full-floor luxury suite, exclusive access, closed-off hallways, custom privacy installations, a near-luxury residence-level setup, all to be covered by the Australian government. The staffer reading the email blinked. Reread the lines. Paused. Reread again. Was this real? The next reaction was immediate. Hey, you need to come see this. That's when the first wave of disbelief spread. It wasn't that Australia had never hosted royalty before. Australia had hosted Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, Princess Diana, Prince Charles, and even Harry himself, with honor, dignity, and often great excitement from the public. The issue wasn't hospitality. Australians were famously warm hosts. But hosting someone as a royal was one thing. Hosting someone who had renounced royal duties while seeming to expect royal treatment was something else entirely. One staff member summarized the mood in 8 words. This doesn't feel right. Another whispered, what is he expecting from us now? Let me ask you the same question the Australian staff quietly asked themselves. Can Harry have it both ways? Can you step away from royal obligation, yet still demand royal privilege? Can you reject the monarchy and still expect the world to treat you like its representative? Those questions sat at the heart of what came next. Because as the request circulated among officials, the reactions wasn't simple annoyance, it was confusion. Some felt it was just an overzealous handler pushing for comfort. Others saw it as entitlement. Others saw it as a test of boundaries. And a few wondered quietly whether the request had come from Harry himself or whether the expectations were being set by someone around him. But one thing was clear. The request wasn't going to be approved without discussion. Within hours, the email had reached higher levels of government. And with each new set of eyes reading the same lines, the momentum shifted from surprise to concern. Because make no mistake, hosting a high-profile figure requires careful planning. Security is expensive. Privacy is non-negotiable. Logistics are complex. But there is a protocol, a scale, a standard. And Prince Harry's request? It blew past every standard threshold. A top-level advisor put it bluntly. This is not a normal private visit request. Because if Harry had been visiting privately, simply as Harry, a former royal living in the United States, he could have easily stayed anywhere he wanted. He could choose a luxury villa, a high-end resort, a secluded oceanfront property, a boutique private retreat. And he could pay for it himself. But this request wasn't for a private stay. It was for a state-supported stay. A luxury, taxpayer-funded, diplomatic-level accommodation request for someone who was no longer a diplomat, no longer a working royal, no longer an official representative of the crown. And that inconsistency raised alarms. Government departments immediately began preparing internal assessments. Who would cover the cost? Would granting the request set a precedent? Would it be seen as favoritism? Would it inflame political anger at a time when cost of living pressures were already a national debate? Meanwhile, advisors began drafting the risk assessment, not for security, but for political fallout. Because every government understands one universal truth. The public might tolerate a lot, but they do not tolerate unnecessary spending, especially on luxury. One advisor wrote a line that would later become a repeating refrain in Parliament. Approval of this request is not in the public interest. While this internal storm gathered in Canberra, something else was happening thousands of kilometers away. The Sussex team was preparing for what they expected would be a smooth, warmly received visit. They were reportedly lining up engagements, crafting messaging, exploring partnerships, and preparing speeches. The last thing they expected was resistance. The last thing they expected was scrutiny. And the absolute last thing they expected was for the request to ever become public. But that's because they didn't know what was coming next. Inside the department office, two staffers had a whispered conversation that would later be described as the moment everything tipped. One leaned in and asked, "Do you think the public would accept this?" The other shook their head instantly. Absolutely not. And just like that, a wall formed between expectation and reality. Hours later, the request was circulated to yet another department, one more senior, more politically sensitive, and more cautious. This department had the final say. They reviewed every line, every number, every expectation. Then came the moment. The decision was made internally. We cannot approve this. But they didn't press send. They didn't respond immediately. They didn't issue a statement. Because before the government could finalize anything, before the official rejection was typed or even crafted, something far more explosive happened. Someone leaked the request. And with that leak, everything changed. One moment, this was a quiet policy discussion. The next, it was a national debate. Phones buzzed. News sites lit up. Producers scrambled. Politicians' offices began fielding calls. Twitter, or X, ignited like dry grass in summer heat. And the government? They were suddenly under a spotlight brighter than any royal event. A staffer remembers the exact moment the first headline hit. Prince Harry requests taxpayer-funded five-star stay for Australia visit. Within minutes, Australia was divided into two fiercely vocal camps. Camp A, he's a prince. Host him properly. Camp B, no title is worth our tax dollars. And as the world watched the arguments erupt, the government faced a new crisis. Whatever they decided, they would be judged. Approve the request? They'd be accused of wasting money. Reject it? They'd spark royal tensions. Ignore it? They'd look incompetent. But as Parliament braced for a political explosion, something else was happening behind the scenes, something almost no one outside the government ever sees. Confusion. Real confusion. Because the request raised a deeper, more complicated question no one had ever faced before. What exactly is Prince Harry now? Is he a royal? Is he a celebrity? Is he a former royal? Is he an advocate? Is he an independent public figure? Is he none of the above? There was no template, no precedent, no guidebook. And this uncertainty fueled more internal panic. While departments debated the classification of Harry's visit, something even more shocking happened. An internal memo summarizing the conversation about Harry's new status was accidentally forwarded to someone outside the intended chain of communication. That person, whose identity remains unknown even now, forwarded it again and again, until it reached the very journalist who had already published the first leak. And that was the moment the firestorm truly began. Because the second leak wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about hotel rooms. It wasn't about cost. It was about status. And status is the one topic the royal family cannot escape. The second headline hit harder than the first. Australian government debates whether Harry should be treated as a royal or a private citizen. In that moment, Harry's public identity, the one carefully managed through interviews, films, declarations, and branding, became the subject of global debate. Was he royal enough? Or not royal enough? Supporters pushed back. Critics cheered. Commentators argued. And in the middle of it all, the Australian government realized something unsettling. This wasn't just a travel request anymore. This was a diplomatic moment, a constitutional moment, a symbolic moment. Inside Parliament, one senior advisor said quietly, "We're not just deciding where he sleeps. We're deciding what he is." In other words, they weren't rejecting a hotel room. They were rejecting a category. Meanwhile, public sentiment hardened by the hour. Callers flooded radio shows. People ranted in supermarkets. Students debated it on campuses. Taxi drivers gave their verdicts before passengers finished their greetings. The country had questions. Why should he get special treatment? Why is he asking us to pay for this? Why can't he book his own hotel? And my personal favorite, one radio caller said, "Mate, if he wants 5-star, he can use 5-star of his own money." But the story wasn't done growing. Because the second leak prompted another round of scrutiny inside Canberra, and this time the scrutiny was aimed inward. How did the memo leak? Who authorized distribution? Were there political motives? Was this sabotage? Or was this simply an overwhelmed staffer losing control of the narrative? No one knew. But one thing became clear. Harry's request wasn't going to be quietly denied. It wasn't going to be managed with subtlety. It was going to be a fight. A fight between tradition and modernity. Between public demand and political caution. Between Harry's expectations and Australia's new attitude toward royalty. And it all began with that single email, the request that sparked a firestorm. But what happened next? What happened once the leaks had gone global? Once Buckingham Palace caught wind of the controversy? Once the Sussex team realized the story was spiraling out of control? What happened behind closed doors? The phone calls, the scrambling advisors, the frantic damage control attempts. That is the story of the next chapter. Because the fallout of the leak wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And what came next would shake both Australia and the royal world in ways no one saw coming. It happened at 7:42 a.m. Sydney time. A routine morning broadcast was just getting underway when a newsroom assistant sprinted down a hallway holding a printed email like it was a live grenade. Producers paused. Editors turned. Something was wrong, or very, very right, depending on how you look at it. Because in the world of news, nothing sets a newsroom on fire faster than a leak. And this leak? This one was nuclear. The assistant reached the senior producer's desk, breathless, eyes wide. "You need to see this," she whispered. The producer read the first 3 lines, then the next 3, then the rest of the document. His eyebrows shot up. He swore under his breath. He reread the final paragraph just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. And that's when he said the 7 words that would echo across Australia for the rest of the day. "Get this on air immediately. Right now." Within 15 minutes, the headline was displayed across the bottom of TV screens nationwide. Prince Harry requests taxpayer-funded 5-star luxury suite for Australia visit. The image accompanying the story was a high-resolution photo of Harry at a charity event, smiling, relaxed, approachable, contrasted with the words taxpayer-funded luxury. It was a perfect, brutal juxtaposition, the kind that sears into public emotion and never lets go. And it worked, because within minutes, the story went viral. Phones buzzed. Hashtags exploded. Talk shows rearranged entire segments. Radio hosts abandoned their scripts. And in homes across the nation, people paused mid-coffee sip and said out loud, "You're kidding me." Let's be honest. Australia reacts to controversy differently than other countries. They don't whisper politely. They don't tiptoe. They don't second-guess their outrage. They say it outright, with chest. And they said it loudly that morning. But where did the leak come from? No one knew yet. No one had time to ask. Because the moment the story hit the public, something else happened. Something far more powerful, far more explosive. The floodgates opened. Within 45 minutes, a second journalist received a copy of the same email. Another newsroom got a screenshot from a trusted source. Then an independent blogger posted what appeared to be the first draft of the travel request. Australia hadn't just gotten a leak. It got hit with a coordinated waterfall of leaks. Someone, or several someones, wanted this story out, and wanted it out fast. What made it even stranger was the tone of the leaked documents. They weren't filled with dramatic language or exaggerated demands. In fact, they were perfectly professional, calm, neutral, almost too neutral, which made the actual content stand out even more. A royal-adjacent figure requesting a taxpayer-funded, fully sealed-off luxury suite for what appeared to be a semi-private visit. Australians didn't care how politely it was written. The content was enough to ignite the country. By 8:10 a.m., arguments were already breaking out online. Some said, "Well, he's still a prince, isn't he?" Others shot back, "No, he quit. He can pay like everyone else." And then came the memes. Oh, the memes. Harry sitting on a gold throne in a hotel lobby. Harry holding an Australian tax form looking confused. Harry photoshopped into a budget motel with the caption, "Your room is ready, mate." It was pure chaos. But not everyone was laughing. Inside Parliament House, the atmosphere had turned from routine to crisis mode. The staffers who had handled the request earlier the previous day were now frantically checking internal systems. Who leaked it? How far had it spread? Who else had copies? What did the media know, and what were they guessing? A senior official slammed their office door and said, "This is a disaster." Because you have to understand something critical. Governments hate losing control of a narrative. They hate leaks. They fear them. Leaks can topple ministers. Leaks can ruin agendas. Leaks can spark unintended foreign tension. And this leak? This one contained all the ingredients of a geopolitical mess. A former royal. A Commonwealth country. A taxpayer-funded request. A sensitive political moment. A public already stressed from economic issues. A perfect storm. And inside that storm, something else happened, the kind of thing that makes bureaucrats sweat. Another leak surfaced. A second one. A follow-up email circulated at midnight the night before. It contained internal discussions about appropriateness and public perception. The leaked excerpt read, "We must consider whether this request aligns with expectations for a non-working royal figure." That phrasing was a dagger. Non-working royal. The phrase was controversial, loaded, diplomatically fragile. It suggested the government was categorizing Harry differently. Not as a diplomat, not as royalty, but as something in between. And when the media picked that up, everything exploded further. The new headline dropped like a bomb. Government questions whether Prince Harry should be treated as a royal. Now the controversy wasn't about money. It was about identity, status, relevance. Was Harry still a prince in the eyes of the Commonwealth? Was he entitled to royal privileges? Or was he a private citizen with a famous lineage? These questions hit harder than anything relating to hotel rooms or budgets, because they tapped into something deeper, the global reevaluation of the royal family's role in the modern world. And Harry, intentionally or not, had become the symbol of that shift. Now, while Australia was drowning in headlines, something else was happening across the globe in Montecito. The Sussex team woke up to a communication emergency. Their phones buzzed simultaneously. Their publicists' inbox flooded. Aides rushed into the morning briefing with frantic expressions. What happened? Was the first question. Who leaked this? Was the second. How do we control it? Was the third. They expected Harry's visit to be framed positively, inspirational, hopeful, charitable. They did not expect headlines claiming he demanded luxury accommodation at taxpayer expense. The team scrambled into calls. Damage control phrases were thrown around. Clarify intent. Diffuse narrative. Emphasize purpose of visit. Push back on inaccuracies. But there was a deeper problem, a problem no PR statement could erase. Australians had already made up their minds. And once Australians are locked into an opinion, changing it is like trying to lift Uluru with a teaspoon. Meanwhile, the Australian public mood was shifting from shock to frustration, not just about the request itself, but about being kept in the dark. One caller on a Melbourne radio program said, "I'm struggling to pay bills, and he wants us to foot a luxury hotel bill? Absolutely not." Another said, "He's welcome here, but not on my taxes." And then someone else said something that caught every host's attention. "If he wants 5-star, let Netflix pay for it." That comment was shared over 100,000 times in 3 hours. By noon, the story had escalated to the point where ministers were being chased down hallways for quotes. Every microphone shoved in their face carried the same question. Will the government approve the request? Most responded with the classic political phrase, "No comment at this time." But one junior minister made a mistake, a small but explosive one. He said, "We are reviewing the request carefully." That phrasing implied the government was taking it seriously, possibly even considering it. And that's when the public snapped. Because reviewing sounded like code for "you're going to do this, aren't you?" By mid-afternoon, hundreds of furious comments flooded official pages. Taxpayers demanded transparency. Some called for protests. Others tagged their MPs demanding answers. This wasn't just becoming a scandal. It was becoming a fight between the public and the government. But the real shock came at 3:27 p.m. when one more leak, yes, a third, detonated across social media. This time it wasn't an email. It wasn't a memo. It was a recording, a short audio clip captured from inside a government break room. A voice, believed to be from a senior staffer, said, "We're not bending over backwards for someone who quit the royal job but still wants the royal perks." That clip hit Australia like a thunderclap. It was raw. It was blunt. It was very, very Australian. And it was the moment everything changed. The story was no longer about a hotel suite. It was about principle. A national conversation erupted. What does Australia owe Prince Harry? What does Harry owe Australia? Should former royals be treated like current royals? Where is the line between respect and enabling entitlement? The debate became philosophical, political, cultural, and surprisingly emotional. Some people felt Harry had been abandoned. Others felt he had abandoned everyone else. Some saw him as a victim of the monarchy. Others saw him as a man cashing in on an identity he rejected. But while the country debated, another question simmered. Who leaked all this? The government launched an internal probe. Departments denied involvement. Staff whispered theories. Journalists protected their sources. And although many pointed fingers, the truth was far more unsettling, because early indications suggested the leaks might have come from multiple different sources across multiple offices, which meant there wasn't just one frustrated staffer. There were several. And that raised a terrifying possibility. The frustration wasn't isolated. It was widespread. The request wasn't just controversial. It was quietly resented. Inside the Australian government, among the people working behind the scenes, the message was clear. They didn't want to fund luxury for someone whose royal status no longer held weight in official terms. But the biggest twist of all was still ahead. Because while Australia was debating tax dollars and titles, while journalists were chasing leads, while parliamentarians were preparing statements, while the Sussex team scrambled, something else was happening. Something that would shift the entire path of this story. Another document existed. A powerful document. A confidential one. One that explained exactly why the government was preparing to deny the request. A document no one, not the press, not the public, not even the Sussex team, had seen yet. A document that would turn the debate from emotional to explosive. And that document was about to surface. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It was the memo that wasn't meant to leave a locked drawer. A document stamped, internal use only, written in the sterile, almost clinical tone only government analysts can produce. The kind of language that feels neutral on the surface but carries the weight of a sledgehammer when read between the lines. This memo didn't leak accidentally. It didn't slip through cracks. It didn't get misplaced. No, someone released it on purpose. And the moment it hit the hands of journalists, the entire narrative surrounding Prince Harry's visit shifted from chaos to crisis. But before we get to the part where the memo went public, you need to understand what was inside it, and why its contents sent shockwaves through Parliament, Buckingham Palace, and the Sussex headquarters in California. Let's start at the beginning. The memo was drafted by a senior travel analysis advisor inside the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Their job wasn't glamorous, evaluating the cost, risk, protocol, and necessity of requests from foreign figures. Not ruling on politics, not making moral judgments, just assessing logistics. This makes what the memo contained even more stunning. Because when a bureaucrat who writes dry, technical notes suddenly produces a document filled with red flags, warnings, and blunt assessments, that means something serious is happening behind the scenes. The memo opened with a sentence so piercing it would become the most quoted line of the entire controversy. Classification of the Duke of Sussex as a private individual must be upheld unless official communication from Buckingham Palace states otherwise. Right there, in one sentence. Everything the Australian government had been quietly wrestling with internally was laid bare. The memo didn't stop there. It outlined the following points, each delivered with the icy precision of someone who knew their words could shape national policy. Prince Harry is not a working royal. Prince Harry is not visiting in an official royal capacity. Prince Harry's accommodation expectations do not align with standard protocol for private travelers, regardless of status. Public justification for taxpayer-funded luxury accommodations cannot be supported. Approval may create precedent for future requests by non-working royals or celebrity figures. Then came the blowtorch paragraph, the part that made even the most seasoned political figures swallow hard. Approval of these requests risks significant political fallout, particularly in current economic conditions. Public perception is expected to be negative, with high likelihood of media criticism and public distrust in government spending priorities. In other words, if we approve this, the country will riot. But the final line of the memo, the one that sparked global interest, was the one nobody expected. Recommendation: decline request. Offer standard diplomatic level accommodation or invite self-funded arrangements. Reread that carefully. Standard diplomatic accommodation. For someone who was not a diplomat, this wasn't just a rejection. It was a reclassification. Australia was drawing a boundary, one that no country had explicitly drawn before. They were the first to publicly question whether Prince Harry should still be treated as royalty in matters of state. The implications were enormous. But here's the part almost no one knew. This memo had been circulating quietly for 48 hours before it leaked. Internal debates were fierce. Some departments supported the memo. Others warned it could damage relations with the UK. A few even suggested rewriting sections to soften the tone. But one advisor refused. Their justification was cold. The truth, however uncomfortable, must guide policy. Inside Parliament, tempers flared. One representative reportedly slammed their notebook on a desk and said, "We can't insult the monarchy like this." Another replied, "He left. He chose to. He made that decision. This isn't insulting the monarchy, it's acknowledging reality." Then someone else chimed in. "Reality or not, the tabloids will eat us alive." It was a mess, political, diplomatic, emotional. And yet, even in the midst of the chaos, the memo held firm. Its logic was airtight. Its language was defensible. Its conclusions were clear. But the emotion surrounding the issue? That was about to explode. Because at 9:12 a.m. the next morning, the memo made its way to a journalist's encrypted inbox. It didn't come with a note. It didn't come with a warning. It didn't even come from a traceable address. It was simply sent. Attachments. Memo_trav_classification_duke Sussex.pdf. The journalist who opened it later said they felt their stomach drop. Because this wasn't just a leak. This was evidence. Evidence that the government was actively preparing to deny Prince Harry's request. Evidence that they were questioning his status. Evidence that the country was divided at the highest levels of authority. And as any journalist would in that moment, they picked up the phone. "Run everything," the editor said. "But verify it twice." By noon, verification was complete. It was real, authentic, undeniable. The editor sat back, exhaled, and said the four words every world leader dreads. "Publish." Lead story. Now. The article went live at 12:03 p.m. And the headline hit like a tidal wave. Leaked government memo recommends rejecting Prince Harry's luxury hotel request, citing status as private individual. If the previous leaks had stirred the public, this one detonated. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. Some celebrated the memo as a win for accountability. Others felt humiliated that such internal debate had gone public. Some accused the government of disrespect. Others accused Harry of entitlement. The comment section turned into a battleground. Good. He's just like anyone else. He should pay for his own hotel. This is embarrassing for Australia. This is embarrassing for him. This is what happens when you quit your job and still expect the perks. But the real damage wasn't happening online. It was happening in Buckingham Palace. Senior officials were blindsided. They had not been informed that Australia was reconsidering Harry's status. They had not seen the memo. They had not even been briefed on the request. And according to sources within royal circles, the reaction was immediate. Is this how Commonwealth nations plan to treat members of the royal family going forward? It was a chilling question, because the answer might be yes. Harry's position as a non-working royal put him in a new category, one nobody knew how to manage. Not the palace, not foreign governments, not even Harry's own team. Speaking of Harry's team, Montecito received the news like a punch to the gut. Emails were exchanged within seconds. Calls made urgently. Lawyers consulted. PR strategists scrambled to craft responses that didn't sound defensive, entitled, or dismissive. But buried beneath the panic was a more personal reaction. Shock. Because for the first time, publicly, officially, a government had said, "You are not a royal for our purposes." And it hurt. While the Sussex team struggled to regroup, the Australian government faced its own crisis. Reporters cornered ministers in hallways. Camera crews waited outside offices. Press secretaries fielded hundreds of calls. Every question was the same. Does the memo reflect the government's official position? No one wanted to answer. Some deflected. Some stalled. Some hid. But one minister, exasperated, overwhelmed, and exhausted, made a mistake. A big one. He said, "The memo reflects considerations that were being examined, yes." Immediately, newsrooms lit up. It was confirmation. Accidental, but confirmation nonetheless. Within minutes, headlines updated in real time. Government confirms reviewing memo that reclassified Prince Harry. Australia was no longer whispering. It was speaking clearly. But the next twist was coming. A twist even the government didn't expect. Because there was a second document. One that made the memo look tame. One that would escalate events into full-blown diplomatic turbulence. A document that exposed the final internal debate, the one that nearly derailed the visit altogether. And this next document? It wasn't written by analysts. It wasn't written by advisors. It was written by someone with power, someone high-ranking, someone whose words carried authority. And when that document leaked, well, what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They weren't supposed to find out this way. Not through a headline, not through a leak, and definitely not through a memo circulating on social media before anyone in London had even finished their morning tea. But that's exactly what happened. Buckingham Palace, the institution famous for controlling information with near-military precision, was blindsided by a situation unfolding on the other side of the world. A situation they didn't initiate, didn't authorize, and didn't see coming. The first person inside the palace to become aware of the Australian memo wasn't a senior advisor. It wasn't a private secretary. It wasn't even a member of the press office. It was a junior communications assistant who happened to refresh a news feed on their desktop computer during a quiet morning shift. They froze, leaned in, read the article twice, then whispered, "Oh, this is bad." They grabbed their phone, dashed down the corridor, and knocked on the door of a senior communications official. The official, irritated at the interruption, said, "This better be important." The assistant handed over the tablet with the headline glowing in bright letters. Australian government memo reclassifies Prince Harry as private individual, rejects royal-level requests. The senior official went from annoyed to confused to alarmed in a span of 5 seconds. "Where did this come from?" they demanded. "Multiple Australian outlets," the assistant replied. "And it's spreading." The official didn't waste another second. They stood, straightened their jacket, and walked briskly toward the communications wing. There are moments inside Buckingham Palace when the atmosphere changes so quickly it feels like oxygen has been sucked out of the room. This was one of those moments. Within minutes, phones rang. Staff rushed. Doors swung shut. Lights flicked on in offices that were usually dark at this hour. Because this wasn't just a story. This was a narrative threat. And narrative threats are treated with the urgency of security threats. You might think the palace wouldn't care about the accommodations of a non-working royal halfway across the world. But they cared. Not because of the hotel. Not because of the money. Not because of the logistics. But because of the implication. A Commonwealth nation had publicly categorized Prince Harry, the son of the reigning monarch, as a private individual, unworthy of traditional royal protocol or privilege. That had never happened before. Not once. Not anywhere. The palace feared one thing above all. Precedent. If Australia did it, what would Canada do? What about New Zealand? Or South Africa? Or any nation where Harry, Meghan, or even future generations might travel? The monarchy relies on consistency, on tradition, on roles being honored, even when individuals no longer actively perform them. But this situation shattered the consistency. Harry was now in a gray zone, a place the monarchy doesn't like, doesn't understand, and certainly doesn't want to normalize. As senior communications officials huddled around a large oak table, someone finally voiced what everyone was thinking. If Australia treats him like a private citizen, it weakens the crown. Another responded, "It weakens the crown? It weakens the institution." Someone else added, "And it weakens the king." Those words hung in the air. Because this controversy wasn't just about Harry. It was about how the world sees the monarchy under King Charles III. Every headline, every leak, every public perception mattered. Just then, a soft knock broke the tension. "The king wants a briefing," an aide announced. Of course he did. The Camelot Room, one of the private briefing rooms inside the palace, was quickly prepared. A small team assembled. Papers were stacked. A tablet displaying the Australian articles was placed on the table. When King Charles entered, he looked composed, calm, regal, but those who know him best can always tell when he's irritated beneath the surface. His steps were quick, his jaw set, his expression restrained. He took a seat. "Explain," he said. The head of communications began recounting the situation. "Your Majesty, earlier today the Australian government's internal memo was leaked. It outlines their intention to treat the Duke of Sussex as a private figure during his visit." Charles raised a hand, signaling he understood the core issue. "That's their right," he said. "But why is this public?" Silence. Because that was the problem. The leak wasn't just embarrassing. It was destabilizing. A palisade finally answered. "It appears multiple departments in Australia were involved, sir." It may not have been one person. Charles exhaled slowly. "So a coordinated embarrassment," he muttered. "Not quite coordinated. More like chaotic. But the effect was the same." Charles leaned back, rubbing his forehead. "What has the Duke's team said?" he asked. The communications chief replied. "Nothing yet, sir. But we expect a response within hours." Charles nodded. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. Not a warm smile, but the tight, weary smile of someone who has been through every type of royal debacle over the past 4 decades and knows a bad storm when he sees one. "This is unfortunate," he said softly. "And inevitable." Those in the room exchanged glances. Inevitable? What did he mean? Charles clarified. When Harry left the family formally, this was always the risk. The world would eventually need to decide who he is. It was the most honest, unfiltered assessment anyone had made since the mail hit Canberra. Because the very thing Australia was struggling with, the classification of Harry, was the same struggle every government, institution, and public-facing entity had been quietly dealing with for years. To some, Harry was still a prince. To others, he was a celebrity. To some, he was a philanthropist. To others, a critic of the monarchy. To some, a future partner in international work. To others, someone whose role was no longer definable at all. And the palace knew that as long as Harry existed in this undefined state, confusion and conflict would follow. Charles ended the briefing with a simple directive. "Keep me updated, and prepare a statement if this escalates." Everyone knew it would escalate. But what Charles didn't know, not yet, was that a second leak was already in motion. Because while the palace was absorbing the memo, the Australian government was internally dealing with the next crisis. A senior advisor, someone high-ranking, had written a private assessment responding to the memo, a document that weighed the risks and the politics in far sharper terms. And that document was about to leak too. But before we get to that, the palace had its own internal turmoil to manage. After the king's briefing, senior aides gathered again. This time in a smaller room, away from the formality of palace meeting spaces. Voices were lower, more anxious. One advisor whispered, "Do we intervene?" Another asked, "Should we contact the Australian High Commission?" A more cautious aide said, "We can't. He's not here as a royal representative. We have no authority." That sentence hurt more than intended. Harry wasn't visiting as a representative of the crown. He wasn't traveling on royal business. He wasn't under the palace's jurisdiction. And so the palace's biggest problem was this. They couldn't step in. They couldn't correct the narrative. They couldn't protect him. They couldn't defend him without contradicting the very agreement made during Harry and Meghan's exit. He wanted independence. He got independence. And with independence comes responsibility, consequences, and in this case, public classification. One palace staffer reportedly said something that summed up the dilemma perfectly. If we interfere, we undermine the arrangement. If we don't interfere, he becomes vulnerable. Either choice hurts the monarchy. Meanwhile, in the communications wing, another advisor noticed something troubling. This isn't just about Harry. This is about the Commonwealth's shifting attitude. That was the unspoken fear. Once one nation sets a precedent, others may follow. And the monarchy cannot survive without the goodwill of its Commonwealth members. At 1 p.m., during another internal review, an aide pointed out, Australia rejecting royal-level treatment for Harry doesn't just affect him. It affects how future royal tours may be perceived. Everyone knew what that meant. If Harry is treated as private and William is treated as royal, comparisons will rise. If Meghan visits privately, demands will be scrutinized. If Charles visits officially, taxpayers will question spending. If future generations tour, precedent may limit what is offered. And the monarchy thrives on consistency, not fragmentation. But here's where things took a darker turn. As palace staff scrambled to stabilize the situation, Someone read the concluding line of the Australian memo, the one that said, "Recommendation, decline request." The room fell silent. They knew the government hadn't officially responded yet. They knew the rejection wasn't public. They knew there was still a chance Australia might soften its stance. But that hope was shattered minutes later. Because not far from Parliament House, in a quiet Canberra office, the second document, the response from a high-ranking official, was about to leak. A document that didn't just recommend rejecting the request. It criticized the Sussex expectations directly. And when that leaked, the story would go from controversial to catastrophic. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with a door closing. A quiet click inside a government building in Canberra. A door that had been opened and shut thousands of times without consequence. But this time, behind that door, a decision was forming. One that would ripple across continents, through royal circles, across political halls, and straight into headlines around the world. The Australian government had reached its breaking point. Because by the time the second memo leaked, the brutally honest one written by a high-ranking official, the situation had escalated from an internal debate to a national spectacle. And Australia, a country that prides itself on fairness, bluntness, and a no-nonsense culture, suddenly faced a choice that would define its position in the global royal landscape. Would they bend? Or would they finally draw a line? But before we get to the exact moment the line was drawn, let's rewind a few hours to understand what pushed the government over the edge. Inside a soundproof meeting room within the Department of Foreign Affairs, a group of senior officials sat around a polished oval table. Some had their arms crossed. Some stared into their notes. Others tapped pens, waiting for someone with authority to speak first. At the head of the table sat the minister, calm, composed, but visibly irritated. "Let's begin," he said flatly. The room quieted. A senior analyst summarized the dilemma. The request exceeds standard protocol for private individuals and resembles accommodations reserved for heads of state or working royals. Another official added, "The media coverage has grown hostile. Public sentiment is overwhelmingly against taxpayer funding." A third chimed in, "We must consider the precedent this sets. If we approve this, we open the door for similar expectations from other non-official visitors." There it was, the word that had been quietly haunting the room. Precedent. Governments fear precedent like storms fear calm. Because once you set one, once you make an exception, once you grant something unusual just this once, you guarantee someone else will demand it next. And so Australia faced not one decision, but two. Do we approve the request? And if we do, what will we be forced to approve next time? One advisor leaned forward. "I want to remind everyone," she said, "that the Duke of Sussex is not here on behalf of the monarchy. He is not representing the crown." He specifically stepped back. Silence. That single reminder carried more weight than any words spoken in the last hour. Harry stepped back. Harry made the choice. Harry defined his path. Australia did not remove him from royal duties, she continued. He removed himself. Our response must reflect that. Another advisor disagreed. This is still the king's son. Rejecting the request may be interpreted as disrespect. The minister sighed, and that's when the turning point arrived. A younger staffer, not senior, not high-ranking, but bold, raised her hand. "Sir, we've hosted thousands of dignitaries, prime ministers, activists, scientists, heroes, everyday Australians doing extraordinary things. We treat them with respect. We protect them. We support them when needed. But we have never, not once, been expected to foot the bill for someone's luxury suite when they are not here on official business." The room shifted, because she wasn't wrong, not even a little. And then she said the line that would later be quoted on talk shows, radio programs, and podcasts across the country. "We are a democracy, not a hotel concierge." The minister's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. That was the line, the defining phrase, the sentence that captured the mood of the country. And with that, the decision, the quiet, final decision, was made. Australia would draw a line. They would decline the request, not out of disrespect, not out of hostility, not out of pettiness, but out of principle. Still, decisions in politics aren't declared abruptly. They simmer. They roll downhill. They gather additional reasoning, additional documentation, additional clarity. And so the next step began, formalizing the decision. A policy advisor prepared a concise explanation intended for internal use. Given the Duke of Sussex's non-official status during his proposed visit, we will offer standard courtesy support consistent with private traveler protocol. Requests for enhanced accommodations are to be declined. Another advisor insisted on adding something else. This aligns with current cost-saving measures and public expectations regarding government spending. The minister nodded. "Make it final," he said. But the moment the rejection became final, even before it was typed up and polished, something unexpected happened. The hotel chain involved in the initial request called. A smooth voice entered the line. "Minister, we'd like clarity on the Duke of Sussex's visit. We are receiving inquiries from our staff about security requirements." The minister hesitated, because at this point, the hotel chain was a character caught in the crossfire. Unprepared, unbriefed, and dangerously close to becoming the next headline. He answered carefully. "The request is under review," he said, "but I advise against making commitments." The hotel representative paused before replying. "We've never been in this position before. If this becomes public, we may have to." His voice trailed off. "May have to what?" the minister asked. "Consider declining the booking." Even the hotel chain, the people who stood to profit the most, didn't want this drama. They had watched the memo leak. They had watched the public outrage. They had watched the media frenzy, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Another line from the call would soon circulate behind closed doors. "We cannot risk being seen as enabling privilege that the government won't support." In other words, if the government says no, we say no too. But that wasn't even the most explosive part. Because at that same moment, on the other side of the globe, Prince Harry's team was growing impatient. Emails from Montecito began arriving in Canberra. Polite at first, then firmer, then sharply worded. One note read, "We expected clarity by now regarding accommodations." Another said, "It is important to finalize arrangements quickly for coordination purposes." A third added, "We are concerned about delays and miscommunication." But that wasn't all. Someone from the Sussex camp, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps intentionally, added a line that raised eyebrows among Australian officials. The Duke expects standard security and privacy measures consistent with his position. The word expects rubbed every official the wrong way. Expect? Expect what? Expect who? Expect why? A country cannot be ordered into deference. A government cannot be pressured into funding. And Australia definitely cannot be browbeaten into submission. The advisor who read the message said quietly, "They still think he's a working royal. That's the issue." The minister muttered, "That's not our issue. That's theirs." The decision to reject the request now felt not just justified, but necessary. Still, something else was happening beneath the surface. The public was waiting. The media was circling. Political analysts were sharpening their commentary. And talk shows were preparing monologues. Australia needed to respond soon. Waiting too long would make it look like indecision. Responding too quickly would inflame tensions. So they prepared the official communication, cautious, polite, diplomatic. But before they could send it, an unexpected voice entered the debate. A senator, outspoken, blunt, unfiltered. He stood before reporters and said, "Australia has more important priorities than funding luxury travel for individuals no longer representing the crown." Boom. That quote traveled across the nation instantly. It appeared on radio within minutes, on morning shows within the hour, on YouTube compilations by evening, on TikTok reaction videos by night. And suddenly, it was official. Australia was drawing a line. No royal status without royal responsibility. No special treatment without official capacity. No taxpayer-funded luxury for anyone who wasn't serving in an official role. But here's the twist. The Sussex team wasn't the only one blindsided. Buckingham Palace was too. Because when the senator's quote reached the UK, it didn't come through official government channels. It came through the news. One palace aide reportedly stared at the headline and whispered, "That's not subtle." But the palace wasn't the most shocked. Harry was. Sources close to him later said he was stunned, frustrated, and deeply confused by the rejection. Not because he wanted luxury for the sake of luxury, but because he believed the request was standard procedure for security reasons. But Australia didn't see it that way. Not anymore. Not after everything. And if you think the situation was about to calm down, You're wrong. Because while Australia was preparing to deliver the rejection politely, something else was happening behind the scenes. Someone else was about to enter the conversation. Someone powerful, influential, unexpected, a player no one in Parliament had predicted. And their involvement would send the entire situation spinning in a direction no one saw coming. Because what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began with a phone call at 6:14 a.m.